Welcome to a special edition of the ALEC Across the States podcast. This is Lee Schalk, and I'm here with Jonathan Williams, ALEC's president and chief economist. We're excited today to talk to you about the 18th edition of Rich States, Poor States, the ALEC-Laffer Economic Competitiveness Index. This is now in our 18th edition. Rich States, Poor States has become an adult this year. This was released in April on tax day, and we had a very exciting launch from a particular state capital. Jonathan?
Hey, you're right, Lee. It just so happens that the number one state now for all 18 years, the great state of Utah, our good friends hosted us. It was great to be out there with Governor Cox and Senate President Stuart Adams from the ALEC Board of Directors and Speaker Schultz, and had a great couple of days. As you know, it was an action-packed couple of days celebrating not just this year at number one, but all 18, which we could probably spend this entire episode talking about so many great virtues of how Utah has stayed at number one. But just kudos again to the good people of Utah and to their elected representatives for leading the way.
Well, it's a great point about Utah, and something that we'll get into a little bit later in this conversation. Utah has not rested on its laurels at all when it comes to economic policy. And this is not a number one ranking that they are simply handed each year. There may be some conspiracy theorists out there that think we have a Utah bias. It's not true. Utah has actually made great strides to improve its state policy landscape when it comes to taxes and spending, and that's why they've remained at number one.
That's right. It's a great point. We brought it up with the press conference that we had there at the governor's residence, and there's some states certainly nipping at their heels for the number one ranking, and we can talk about a few of those later. But one of the interesting things that Josh Meyer from our team calculated that I found fascinating that we talked about at the press conference, and now I've heard the governor talk about subsequently and others, is if Utah would have just rested on its laurels back in 2007 after it ranked number one in the first edition of Rich States, Poor States. I remember then Senate President Wayne Niederhauser, I guess he wasn't Senate President then, but he was chair of the tax committee, had just done the flat tax, and Utah was in great shape economically. And if they would have just stopped and done nothing else, and after being number one and saying, hey, we were top in the country, they would be number 23 today, we think, in economic outlook. So that just goes to show what we've always said in this from day one, and certainly becoming more and more true all the time. You can fall behind by standing still. And when so many states are moving in the right direction at cutting taxes and looking to create jobs and build more economic activity in their states, it's not enough just to say we used to have a good policy outlook. It's so important to keep hitting the gas forward and continuing to make that progress like Utah has.
That's right. And Utah, again, the proof is in the pudding, leading the nation in job growth and GDP growth. Now, before we dive into the rest of the results from the 18th edition, I want to take a step back and talk about the genesis of this project. I mean, Rich States, Poor States, it's become really a flagship publication at ALEC. It's a project of the ALEC Center for State Fiscal Reform, but it's also a joint effort that we work on with Dr. Arthur Laffer and economist Stephen Moore. And Jonathan, I know that this is one of the very first projects that came across your desk when you were a new ALEC employee. Tell us a little bit about kind of what this project was, how it started out, and how it's kind of grown over the years.
Well, you're right. It was a day one project for me at ALEC when I started in May of 2007. And Art Laffer, who has been working on this for decades, has been keeping the data and keeping a ranking book of the states. And Steve Moore, our great friend, then at the Wall Street Journal editorial board, had been writing so many great things over the years on free market economics and such a great thought leader as well. And they had come to ALEC and said, wouldn't it be great if a state organization were able to put out an annual ranking where legislators could compare themselves versus the other 49 states, and taking off this inherent idea that's really from the American experiment, is here we are almost 250 years into our nation's experiment. One of the great things about it is we have these 50 laboratories of democracy that our founders wisely enshrined into the Constitution, that they were very much against central authority and a big, strong central government in Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan always reminded us that it was not the federal government that created the states, but the states that created the federal government. And taking off of that idea of having a way that state lawmakers and this inherent competition between states can rank themselves on the policy variables that actually matter for why some states are growing and some states are not. And that's the great thing about it. As you mentioned a minute ago, the proof is in the pudding. And the states that we have ranked number one or high in the ranking in rich states, poor states have been some of the fastest growth states in America. Unsurprisingly, when you follow the formula of limited government and free markets and federalism, the ALEC principles that are on the door here on our logo as well, that has some great results. And so it's something that Laffer had been studying for years before and Steve had been writing about. But, ALEC was the perfect home for it, to say, for ALEC men and women serving in the 50 state capitals, how can we tell if we're doing a good job and what do we need to do to make ourselves more competitive? And that's, of course, what the questions that rich states, poor states answers every year.
Yeah, and I think why this is so impactful is because we know Americans can and do vote with their feet in favor of a new home state that has competitive economic policies and job opportunities. And these are states that job creators are moving to. So we asked the question when putting together this report 18 years ago, what are those key policy variables that really determine and can help position a state for success and growth in the future? So some of those variables that comprise our economic outlook rankings include things like the top marginal personal income tax rate, the top marginal corporate income tax rate, personal income tax progressivity, property tax burden, sales tax burden. Does a state levy estate or inheritance taxes? What's the state minimum wage? Does a state have a right to work law? And I could go on and on, but we've got 15 of these variables. That is how we calculate the economic outlook ranking. These are equally weighted. And then we also put together an economic performance ranking, which looks at things like job growth, GDP growth,
in the migration piece of
the migration piece.
Their feet. And that's such a key piece of it. But I think it's important to note on the 15 variables, you mentioned they're equally weighted. And oftentimes we get asked, why choose these 15? And it's a good question because you could, in theory, choose hundreds of different variables and what matters across states. But we really chose this 15, and they've been the same, or relatively the same 15 over the course of the entire index. We initially, have been thinking about school choice. It's something that we may consider bringing in the future because economic freedom and education freedom are totally linked.
Yes.
But we look at these 15 for a couple of reasons. And one, Laffer's research over the last 50 plus years has said they're some of the most determinant factors for why some states grow and some states don't. But then just as importantly as a ranking that state legislators use on a daily basis in America's 50 state capitals, there are policy variables that legislators directly control. And that's so important because there's lots of different ranking systems out there, and so many of them deal with things that legislators only wish they could control, such as, the weather. And being from Michigan, as you know, Lee, we'd like to warm it up a few degrees in the winter in Michigan, and legislators in Lansing could only wish that they had that kind of control. But, that's obviously outside of any kind of legislative oversight. So we focus on things that matter for growth and that matter for state legislators that they can change and do change every single year.
Yeah, and that's, one thing I'll just add here too. If you're listening to this, you can follow along by going to richstatespoorstates.org, and we've cataloged all of these metrics, all of this data over 18 years. The other thing to bear in mind is that this has really become a go-to resource for principled state legislators across the country. I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of state legislators over the years have utilized this as a resource. And as our team travels around the country, Jonathan, I don't know how many times you've given a Rich States, Poor States presentation, but when you do something like this that's ranking the 50 states, you can really not only show lawmakers how their state stacks up against the other 49 states, but you can really hone in and look at how tax policy within specific regions can make such a great impact. We're talking the Southeast or the Midwest or in New England, for example. there are just such clear examples of how something like a top marginal personal income tax rate can have on a state economy or attracting new businesses or individuals. And then, of course, there are 9 states that don't tax personal income at all.
That's the right flat tax, by the way. Well, 0%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, I think most are picking up on this by now, but that's really kind of our North Star. How can we get these tax rates to be in a position of being as pro-growth as possible?
Yeah, it's a good point. And like over the last 18 years, I've noticed, it wasn't like nobody was talking about these things, but I think rich states, poor states, and ALEC brought them to the forefront. As I remember, there were very little discussion around how people vote with their feet when it comes to moving from state to state for taxes and other economic policy reasons before we started rich states, poor states. And it's really become a mainstream issue that people look for every single year to see, is my state gaining or losing population? Obviously, members of Congress pay attention every 10 years when state lawmakers redraw their congressional districts, and they always have. But I think it's brought it into the mainstream of coverage across the 50 states. Is what we doing helping or hurting our population growth? But then you also look at, you mentioned the personal income tax. I can think of a few different policies that really matter, I think, the most out of the 15, the personal income tax being, I think, first and foremost. And I think it's become really synonymous with free market economic thinking, is what are the most damaging ways that you raise revenue? Obviously, states have to raise revenue from somewhere if they need to provide government services. We can argue how big or how small the size of government should be, and those are often important debates, even within different states that are governed by the same party, let's say. But, that's a important question. And states are looking, I think, rich states, poor states has made a monumental difference across the country in the minds of state legislators to say, all right, we need to raise revenue. Let's do it in the least damaging way. And the way to do that, based on the research of rich states, poor states, and others, is avoiding over-reliance on income taxes. And whether that means states are cutting income tax rates, and we've seen over half the states in the last number of years coming out of the pandemic make substantial cuts to taxes, and especially income taxes, whether we've seen states move towards the flat tax, and we can talk more about that because that's been an incredible flat tax revolution that we've seen sweep the country in recent years, or what we've seen more recently is even states looking to eliminate their personal income tax altogether. And just this state legislative session, as you know, we saw our friends in Mississippi and our friends in Oklahoma both take steps to vote to eliminate the personal income tax with triggers over a number of years, and showing that dedication to say, let's get rid of this inhibitor to economic growth.
Yeah, that's really been amazing to watch this year, and that momentum that really has picked up across the states, this flat tax revolution at the state level over the last few years. So now that we've given some background on what this project is all about, what we're looking at, why it matters, how it's been utilized, let's dive into the 18th edition rankings a little bit.
The winners and the losers.
The winners and the losers. So I'm going to start with reading off the top 5 and the bottom 5. So starting at number 1, as we all know, Utah came in at number 1 for economic outlook. Number 2, Tennessee, followed by Indiana, North Carolina, and North Dakota at number 5. So a couple comments here, a couple things that jump out at me. Obviously, Utah, we talked about, number 1, 18 years in a row. Tennessee is one of those no income tax states that we talked about. Indiana has just been a quiet champion of conservative policies. We could, spend a whole podcast talking about them. North Carolina, my home state, they have been as low as, I want to say, 26th in the rankings, as recently as like 2011, 2013, that time frame. Incredible turnaround story in North Carolina with tax reform. And then North Dakota, another state that does not like to tax income. So that's the top 5 reactions from you, Jonathan.
Yeah, we should really do an episode on all 5 of these because they deserve it. Utah, we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but I mentioned is the flat tax, one of the original states in modern times that went to a flat tax from a progressive income tax. They've also tackled pension reform, which is an area that so many states still need to handle. And as states look at creating their own DOGE efforts and government efficiency efforts, they really need to look at the costs versus the benefit of government-provided benefits like like healthcare and pensions, and that's something Utah has done effectively. And they've also done something on property taxes that you and I talk about all the time, as they become the ALEC model of truth in taxation to really put the accountability to where it deserves to be when it comes to what is driving property taxes. And at the end of the day, it's local government spending decisions about their size and scope of government that drives property tax burdens in the vast majority of cases. And Utah has really gotten the handle around that and kept it under control. Tennessee's a great example of a state. They moved up 10 spots this year from number 12 to number 2. We brought them up in the press conference out in Salt Lake City. And I know it sent a few shockwaves of fear across the minds of Utah legislators that Tennessee is catching up that quickly, but being a no-income tax state certainly helps. And then you kind of group Indiana, at least I do, Indiana and North Carolina. They're taking different trajectories to get there, but both of those states in the first couple of editions of Rich States, Poor States were middle of the pack, and now they're both top 5. So just they're kind of the turnaround stories in different ways. And then North Dakota, a state that doesn't have a lot of room for error, given that they compete with South Dakota, a no-income tax state, and North Dakota's done some good things, including pension reform just recently.
100%. Yeah, I think that's a great synopsis of the top 5, and maybe we'll have to do some deep dive episodes on a couple of these stories. Moving to the bottom 5, some of this won't be a huge shocker when you think about the high tax and high spending states, but I'll start at number 50 and I'll work my way back. So number 50, we've got New York, followed by Vermont, New Jersey, California, and Illinois. So when I look at these states, these are sort of, New York and California, those jump out at me a lot. But these are states that have really become the poster child or children of really bleeding residents, hundreds of thousands of people packing up their bags and moving to a new state. A lot of those folks, from New York, they head down to Florida. They head down to a no-income tax state, a state with a similar population size, but that's able to pull off an environment of economic freedom by spending half the money, which is really incredible. And of course, California, we know that residents are leaving, and they're going all over. I mean, they're going to all the western states. A lot of them are moving down to Arizona, which is another one, really our top 10 state in this year's edition, number 6. But I think there are some obvious warning signs when you look at these perennial losers in rich states, poor states that have really dismal economic outlook.
Yeah, really, you think of the Reagan line about the liberal view of the economy can be summed up as this: if it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it; if it stops moving, subsidize it. And that's the approach that these bottom 5 states have generally taken for a very long time. And look at the results. Don't take our word for it. Look at the outmigration. Look at the lack of economic growth. Look at just what it meant for small business during especially the lockdowns of COVID, added with bad policy on taxes and regulation. And if anything, I think these bottom 5 states, not to overgeneralize, although kind of easy to do in the case that all of these states have a very liberal view of the economy, they prove the Laffer curve in concept. The Laffer curve in theory makes a lot of sense. It's hard to argue with, but in practice, when you raise tax rates and you become uncompetitive, you actually don't gain revenue. So these are states that have been raising taxes for years and years and years, and yet they're out-migration states because Americans vote with their feet towards more economic opportunity and freedom. And what do you find at the end of the day? Who has the biggest perpetual budget deficits of any state? It's the states that keep raising taxes and become more uncompetitive every single year. That's the Laffer curve in a nutshell. You raise taxes, you get less revenue because you have less economic activity. Our good friend George Allen, former governor and senator here in Virginia, it's always with us at the Reagan Ranch when we put together our ALEC event there. And he puts it a great way. People are not trees. They don't stick around and just sit there. They move and they respond to incentives, or in the case of these bottom 5 states, disincentives, and no jobs, people take off.
Well, on the point of California, here's a staggering figure. So California, again, 47th in economic outlook. Again, no change from last year. The state has lost more than 2.2 million residents on net since 2014. It's kind of a mind-boggling number to wrap your head around. And keep in mind that the Golden State has a top marginal personal income tax rate of 14.4%, which ranks them 48th on that metric. So really some staggering figures, and unfortunately not super surprising to see that ranking. But getting back to some of the good news in this year's report.
You feel a little depressing sticking with the bottom five there, don't you?
Yeah, I don't want to stay there too long because there are a lot of winners, a lot of bright spots, and states that we need to be holding up as examples to follow. So I'm going to pick one or two of my favorites from this year. One of those would be the state of Arkansas. So Arkansas came in at number 10 for economic outlook. They improved by 5 spots. This was their best ever ranking in 18 years of rich states, poor states. And it follows 6 consecutive years of personal income tax rate cuts and 5 consecutive years of cuts to the business income tax rate. This really is an incredible success story in Arkansas. Again, a state that as recently as 2015 was an out-migration state that is now gaining population. What do you think about Arkansas? We've got some great legislative leaders that are ALEC members out there in the natural state.
Yeah, Senator Jim Dotson, of course, being on the ALEC Board of Directors. We speak to him often about this. He's been a key voice in this Arkansas comeback. It's hard to ignore, though, what the message from the top is in Arkansas, from the executive, the chief executive, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, an incredible vision for more economic growth. She's made it her goal by the time she's done as governor to have Arkansas as a no income tax state. And, why is that? I think it's one is she absolutely believes in it, knows the principles, and knows the effectiveness of the states that are avoiding income taxes or getting their way off of income taxes. But I think part of it also is economic necessity for Arkansas, because when you think about Arkansas and its proximity to some of the most competitive states in the country, Lee, I'm on Hugh Hewitt with our State of the States ALEC segment often, and we've talked about this as a common feature. The SEC is not just a competitive conference for football; it's an incredibly competitive conference when you think of the states within that, whatever that means, I guess, where football conferences are these days. But at least the old SEC of these states are some of the most competitive in the country. When you think of where Arkansas is, you got to compete with Texas next door. You got to compete with Tennessee next door. You got Florida in the region. You've got North Carolina, we've talked about in the region, among all the other states doing good things, right? And so there's not an option for Arkansas unless you continue to become more competitive. And so I know they've been very aggressive at this. In case of some years, they come back and cut taxes in the regular session, and then they call a special session to cut taxes even more because they had surplus money coming in. So they're taking it seriously, and we're big fans of the turnaround that we've already seen. And I think we expect very good things ahead for Arkansas.
You're right. I mean, in a region that is that competitive, if you are backpedaling, if you are not aggressive in your policy approach, you're going to get eaten alive.
Exactly. I mean, the concept that we were talking about, states fall behind by standing still, absolutely true. But in a competitive region like the Southeast, you can fall behind even by doing good things if it's not aggressive enough. And I think that's what Arkansas realizes.
So I will move on to another SEC school or state, and that is Louisiana. Louisiana improved from 31st in the 17th edition to 18th this year. They jumped 13 spots. And I know part of that has been because of lower income taxes, moving to a flat tax. A lot of that is fueling this improvement. Now, Louisiana does have a lot of work to do when it comes to an out-migration problem. However, the economic outlook ranking would suggest that leaders in the Pelican State are laying a really strong groundwork for growth in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the turnaround is absolutely a real thing in Louisiana as well. They're more recent into the turnaround after the election of Governor Landry just recently. But I mean, he's serious about economic growth and a turnaround story that's much needed in a state that's lagged the region, certainly lagged the nation in economic growth in recent years. They went through a tough patch when it comes to outmigration, as you mentioned, some of the worst economic growth. They had all kinds of issues that they're dealing with. But I remember we got a call from Mark Wright, who's the majority leader in the House and our ALEC chair, asked us to come testify last fall as they're leading up for this flat tax discussion. So we brought the resources from rich states, poor states to the committee. We talked about our research and analysis. And then, of course, they took it from there, got it passed. And what they ended up passing, which was why Louisiana was the biggest winner and turnaround story in this 18th edition of Rich States, Poor States, was a flat tax at 3%, which puts them in a very competitive position in a competitive region. And it's exactly what they needed to do. Now, certainly there's some other things that Louisiana still needs to tackle on regulatory reform and tort reform and other areas I know they're talking about this year. But that was a key down payment, I think, on the Louisiana comeback. So congratulations again to our friends in the legislature and to Governor Landry for getting that done.
Absolutely. Congratulations to our friends in Louisiana. The other state that I will touch on, and I think is worth talking about because the ALEC 2025 national chair hails from this state, and that is West Virginia. Of course, I'm talking about our friend West Virginia Senator Patricia Rucker. The Mountaineer State also saw strong gains this year. They climbed 7 spots to 16th place overall. And, a lot of that, again, due to some improvements in fiscal policy. Jonathan, we're sitting here in Virginia, and of course, West Virginia is a border state. So I think that we may be starting to feel some of that state competition with our neighbors there to the west. What has West Virginia done in the last couple of years? Because they've truly had a turnaround. And, like I said with Arkansas was recently an outmigration state. So was West Virginia. For years and years, it was notoriously a state where individuals were packing up their bags, heading to greener pastures, leaving the state if they could. Now we're seeing residents move into West Virginia on net. Now they may still be having some shrinking population. They've got an older population. However, there are people, Americans on net, moving into West Virginia. So what is causing this West Virginia comeback?
Well, I'm very bullish about the future of West Virginia and Senator Rucker playing a big role in that, and Governor Morrisey now. I'm a huge fan of Governor Morrisey. I know you met with him when you were over there at the Capitol this session. I think he's one of really America's all-star free market governors right now.
Agreed.
And you look at what they've done over time, West Virginia going back, you can go back 100 years, and West Virginia up until just this last year was an out-migration state for 100 years, a century straight. Every
Crazy.
single year in, year out for 100 years. Think about that for a second. Just unbelievable. They lost their 3rd congressional district. They went from 3 U.S. House seats to 2 U.S. House seats in 2020, which was a long string of losing their population, which led to that political loss. And I think people realize that you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so in recent years, they've enacted right to work and worker freedom, which has been a huge economic boon for states that have done that. That's been a huge trend throughout the Great Lakes and Midwest region, as we've seen. They've also done regulatory relief and cut taxes. But one of the other things I mentioned a little bit earlier, Milton Friedman, he always had the hypothesis that when you combined economic freedom that we've been talking about and some of these policies that produce more economic freedom for hardworking individuals, combine that with education freedom. It's exactly what
Yes.
West Virginia did in 2021 with the Hope Scholarship led by our national chair, Patricia Rucker in the Senate, a true hero in the school choice revolution that's sweeping the nation. You combine those things and great things are going to happen. And when you combine the proximity also geographically with where West Virginia is, especially Harper's Ferry, and you get into the metro kind of exurban DC area, and when families are given a choice and they can choose between between Maryland, which isn't much of a choice when you're looking at free market policies and school choice. Virginia, thank God for Glenn Youngkin and Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears fighting the good work over the last number of years. They've been hit by a lot of progressive majorities stopping their reforms here in Virginia. And so West Virginia has an amazing opportunity to just leapfrog ahead in the region. And we've seen exactly that coming out of the pandemic. More Americans had the freedom to live and work wherever they'd like. And West Virginia provides an extremely competitive way of enhancing your quality of life at a lower cost of living.
100%. I think that was well stated. Couldn't agree with you more on West Virginia. And they've got a lot more that they can get done out there. I mean, they're at 16th overall. We have them ranked as 44th in our remaining tax burden metric. So there are still a lot of taxes that can be slashed and cut to create savings for West Virginians. But a great success story, and I think the future is bright for West Virginia. So, Jonathan, before we wrap up here, you mentioned a little bit about some of the bright spots when it comes to state tax reform in 2025. What are some of the other states? I mean, if you could sum up the trend that we've seen this year with states trying to phase out their personal income taxes or lower rates, I mean, who are the biggest winners this year? And the reason I'm asking is because, of course, these are the states that are setting themselves up to improve in next year's Rich States, Poor States rankings. So maybe a little bit of a preview of the states that are on the rise, on the move for next year.
Well, yeah, there's some really good ones there. I mean, Oklahoma and Mississippi being, clear standouts with removing those phase outs of the personal income tax this session. And then you add in, Kansas was a big one this year with Senate President Ty Masterson, last year's ALEC National Chairman. He's been fighting this fight for a long time. They were running into roadblocks. They had the veto from Governor Laura Kelly once again on their tax reform bill, which is a flat tax. And they overrode the veto this time. They kept all the Republicans together and actually overrode it to say enough is enough. We've had 10 years of being blamed for the Kansas tax cuts. This is a episode in itself right now. You've heard me talk about it a million times. Anywhere you've gone over the last decade, the left, the people that do not like tax cuts at all, say you can't cut taxes because it ruined the state of Kansas. Well, now we have a counterpoint to that to say that because Kansas did it right and they've kept spending in check and they cut taxes. I mean, that's one of the most key lessons of rich states, poor states is spending equals taxation at the state level in these balanced budget environments. And so having Kansas get it right this time and go on the board as the 7th flat tax state in recent years is an incredible accomplishment. So those three, I think, are the three big standouts, but there's a whole lot more that we don't have time to probably get into in this episode.
I think that's a great spot to leave it. Just some great news coming from the state level this year on some of these victories, and so many ALEC legislators, these policy champions that are doing the heavy lifting to get this done on behalf of their constituents, hardworking Americans that are going to be reaping the benefits of paying lower taxes, being able to keep more of their hard-earned paycheck. As much drama as there always is in Washington, D.C., we continue to put our faith in what's happening in state capitals and the incredible men and women of ALEC. We're happy to provide these resources. Rich States, Poor States. As always, you can find these rankings, all of this data at richstatespoorstates.org. And Jonathan, we may have to come back for a part 2, maybe to continue this discussion. It feels like we just scratched the surface, but I think this was a great conversation. So thanks for giving us some insights on this year's report.
Let's do it. And I think as we close out, as we're thinking about what's happening in Washington, a lot of our states are saying, hey, we're cutting taxes. And they're looking at Washington to say, let's not let the Trump tax cuts expire because that would undo a lot of this important work that the states are doing.
All right. Well, once again, visit richstatespoorstates.org to dive into these rankings. Until next time on the ALEC Across the States podcast.